Nice to meet you. 안녕하세요. Can you hear me? Thank you. I'm so happy to hear, to tell, to have the chance to tell my interpretation about Ezekiel. I share my resume on the screen. Can you see? Thank you. I will read it, and partly I will skip it because of the time limit. Then I will start. Introduction. In this presentation, we reconsider the book of Ezekiel from the point of view of the expression of religious ideology against the context of exile, which was an extremely difficult situation for maintaining belief. The book of Ezekiel insists that the cause of exile is the profanation of the sacredness of Yahweh, interprets the invasion of Jerusalem by Babylon as its purification, and finally it describes the new Israel as purified and guarded against profanation. Because of such a priestly expression and Ezekiel's origin as a priest, it has been long discussed whether the identity of Ezekiel should be that of a prophet or a priest. The argument of this presentation is that the book of Ezekiel should be interpreted as a response of a priest who confronted the exile, which was the crisis of his belief as a priest of Yahweh, through the function of the prophet. In this presentation, introducing the set interpretation, we will reconsider the book of Ezekiel as an expression of a religious ideology in the context of exile, which was an extremely difficult situation for the believers in Yahweh. Chapter 1, the discussion about the identity of Ezekiel, prophet or priest. First, I would like to confirm the debate over Ezekiel's identity. Ezekiel is of priestly origin and is known as the most priestly prophet. For example, it is because of his strong resistance to impurity, or because of the similarity between the content after chapter 40 and the so-called priestly source of the Pentateuch. Ezekiel is said to be difficult to understand, and compared to other prophets, research on Ezekiel has been relatively delayed. And one of the reasons for this is pointed out to be his priestly side. Garambush says, historical critics of the late 19th and early 20th century viewed Ezekiel's priestly concerns and visions of the restored temple negatively, reflecting an anti-Jewish bias that was typical of much Protestant scholarship. Ezekiel was condemned for his legalism and was seen as a precursor of the decline toward the Judaism of the time of Jesus, which was viewed as overly ritualistic. As mentioned above, in the history of research on Ezekiel, it can be seen that his aspect of priesthood has been negatively evaluated due to anti-Semitic bias. Next, we will confirm a current research trend. An explicit denial of Ezekiel's priestly function is, for example, Baruch Schwartz. Schwartz said that the fact of Ezekiel's priestly path, background, and heritage is not questioned, and that Ezekiel explains what went wrong, depicts the result of what was wrong, and predicts the eventual rectification of everything that went wrong from toughly priestly standpoints. Although he acknowledged Ezekiel's priestly lineage, but not his priestly functions. According to Schwartz, Ezekiel was a visionary, not a legislator. Since the office of the priest was inseparably linked to the abode of God, worship and ceremonies became impossible after the temple was destroyed. As a result, the priest ceased to be a priest, and only his family line remained. In addition to the ceremonial role, the functions of the priest, such as divination by God and teaching the people of the law and the traditions of Israel, cannot be found in the action of the prophet. These are the main points of Schwartz's argument. Strictly speaking, Schwartz may be right in claiming that the priesthood and its functions are inconceivable without the temple. But the claim that Ezekiel did not perform a priestly function is false. Schwartz, for example, claims that Ezekiel did not transmit the Torah, but is commanded, for example, in chapter 43, verse 11, to make known to them all the forms and statutes and laws. The problem with Schwartz's argument is that it clings too much to the premise that the existence of the temple is the premise of the priesthood. Schwartz's argument that he denies Ezekiel's priestly function at all is not valid in examining Ezekiel's priesthood. Next, I will confirm the assertion that positively recognize the priestly function of Ezekiel. Andrew Main argues that Ezekiel's priesthood persisted and was central to his prophetic activity. Although, like Schwartz, Main also finds Ezekiel's separation from the temple in Jerusalem to be a problem. But he says, as is apparent from even a cursory reading of the text, the language of ritual continues to dominate Ezekiel's understanding of Israel's past sins, present judgment, and future hope, and emphasizes the clear continuity of priestly identity in Ezekiel. Main cites 3 points. The practice of purity, the metaphorical or as symbolical ritual, and vision of ritual, all of which contribute to the image of Ezekiel as priest. Excuse me, I must skip some sentences. Go to next page. As mentioned above, Main points out that Ezekiel's prophetic activity was based on his identity as a priest, and that the content of his message and the framework he presented were also in line with the priestly context. This view of Main is considered a reasonable assessment of Ezekiel's priesthood. On the other hand, Main does not acknowledge Ezekiel's priestly functions beyond teaching, as he states that the visions of a free operational cult in the new city and temple remain a vision. But, for example, as we will see later, the command given by Yahweh to Ezekiel in priestly term to bear the punishment, Nasabon, repeated in chapter 4, verse 5 to 6, is not a message from Ezekiel. Here it is suggested that Ezekiel may have a priestly function other than a teaching. So far, I have confirmed the claims of Ezekiel's priesthood from the standpoint of denial and affirmation. The decisive significance of the departure from the temple and its destruction has been pointed out, and the importance of the priestly framework in understanding the event of exile. It was confirmed that ceremonial terms and categories were also used in Ezekiel's prophecy, and that the continuation of the priestly function was recognized in the point of teaching distinction. Thus, it is confirmed that the priesthood is deeply involved in the activities of the prophet Ezekiel. However, does Ezekiel's priesthood remain at the level of a framework for understanding and grasping events and their expressions were at the level of teaching. Next, we will introduce the presenter's interpretation, focusing not only on the elements, but also the context of the story. Chapter 2, priestly description in the course of prophecy of Ezekiel. Ezekiel, who bears the punishment of Israel and Judah. As an introduction to the priestly elements in the context of Ezekiel, note the phrase bear the punishment, Nasabon, in chapter 4, verse 4 to 6. Here, Ezekiel is ordered by Yahweh to bear the punishments of Israel and Judah, following his calling as a prophet. Abon is one of the key words in the book, which is set against the backdrop of captivity, exile. As we'll discuss later, there are different interpretations of the Nasa Abon commanded to Ezekiel ですね。But the presenter argues that it is appropriate to understand it as a priestly function from a consideration of the context. In the following, after confirming the meaning of Abon and Nasa Abon, I will examine the assertion in previous studies. I will skip the contents of TDOT. The above is the outline of Abon and Nasa Abon. What is the meaning of the Nasa Abon commandment to Ezekiel in chapter 4? First, explicitly denied is the possibility that Ezekiel owes his own Abon. There is no account of Yahweh blaming Ezekiel's own Abon, resulting in Ezekiel's death. It is clear from the fact that it is clearly stated in chapter 4 that Ezekiel bears those of Israel or Judah. After the possibility of bearing one's own Abon is eliminated, what remains is bearing the other's Abon. What does Ezekiel do with Abon of others? It is conceivable that it indicates a compensatory suffering as shown in Isaiah chapter 53, the servant of suffering. And this understanding is given by Walter Smery, Brownlee, Blankinsop, etc. Smery, for example, argues that we can scarcely deny that the ideas are set in motion here, which were to be more fully worked out in Isaiah 53, again probably in a prophetic figure. On the other hand, Paul Joyce, Moshe Greenberg, Margaret Odell, etc., argues that there is no such thing as compensation or redemption. Joyce, while acknowledging that expression Nasabon can have a wide variety of meanings, does not here mean forgive, and that Ezekiel bears the punishment of the nation in a way that resembles the second Isaiah. He argues that it cannot be said to be a vicarious or atonement of suffering. As the basis, Joyce argues that such an idea is precluded by Ezekiel's consistent emphasis in chapter 18 that the punishment for sin is borne by the offender. Options differ on this point, as noted above. It would be clear that Ezekiel had or was charged with a task that was beyond his personal domain. In that sense, the compensatory understanding represented by Smery is attractive, but it is not supported when considering the context of the book. It is clear from the fact that Ezekiel was not targeted by Yahweh, as shown in second Isaiah, the servant of suffering. Nor was he expelled from the community like the scapegoat in Leviticus 16. What then was Ezekiel required by bearing the collective Avon? In TDOT, as a function of the priests in relation to Nasa Avon, some part of the office of the priests and the Leviticus moves Avon from Israel and the sanctuary, or representatively bears it, or renders it harmful by the nature inherent in them. As example, Exodus 25, Leviticus 10, and Numbers 18 were introduced. Exodus 28 is the place where the regulations regarding the clothing and equipment, such as the ephod of the priests who serve Yahweh, are written. From 28 onwards, he is commanded to make the emblem to be attached to the turban, which Aaron takes away from the guilt of the holy offering consecrated by the son of Israel, so that they may be accepted by Yahweh. In other words, in this passage, while gaining the auxiliary power of the insignia, it is thought that the priest has the function of removing a bone by wearing it. Then there is Leviticus 10, where in the sanctuary eating, the sacrificial he-goat takes away the guilt of the congregation and makes atonement for them. From these accounts, we recognize, albeit in a different way, the priest's function of removing the bone to make the offering and the congregation acceptable to Yahweh. What is interesting about this theme of removal of a bone is that the book of Ezekiel claims that Yahweh's attack on Israel is the cleansing of a bone. Yahweh's attack on Israel as the cleansing of their bone. In the book of Ezekiel, Yahweh brings utter destruction to Israel with a bone. Interestingly speaking, in the context of cleansing, tahar. The verb tahar occurs 98 times in the Hebrew Bible, about half of which times in Leviticus, 12 times in Ezekiel, and 10 times in Numbers. Tahar is a term used primarily in religious and ritual context, and Yahweh's response to Israel's Avon needs to be viewed in a similar context. If we check the content of the relationship between Israel and Yahweh in the occurrence of Tahar in Ezekiel, then in 22, Yahweh in the prophecy condemned Israel as a land that will not be cleansed. In 24, which appears 3 times on the day of the Babylonian invasion of Jerusalem, Yahweh's wrath against Israel as fire, and Jerusalem as a pot in which to boil flesh and bones, thereby denoting the people of Jerusalem, and the burning of the pot by fire is understood as an act of Yahweh's cleansing of Israel's uncleanness and lust. In chapter 36, it is announced that Yahweh will cleanse Israel from its uncleanness, idols, and sins to sanctify his famous name. Chapter 37 tells us that Yahweh will deliver and cleanse Israel from all its transgressions. Of a particular note above is chapter 24, where the Babylonian invasion of Jerusalem is claimed to be the cleansing by fire of Yahweh's wrath against the defiled and lusty Jerusalem. An overview of Avon in Ezekiel confirms that the Babylonian invasion of Jerusalem is understood as evoking Israel's Avon. The Babylonian attack is, of course, a crucial element in the book of context of captivity and exile. the description of the Babylonian invasion, which resulted in the destruction of Israel and Jerusalem, as a reminder of Israel's abhorrence and cleansing of its defilement, is crucial to the contextual understanding of the book of Ezekiel. The repeated attack on Israel and Jerusalem by Yahweh and the resulting destruction and desolation of Israel and Jerusalem are characteristic of Ezekiel. However, the attack on Israel and Jerusalem in this book does not simply bring devastation, but contains the meaning of destruction as purification, to purify the impurity. From the above, it is confirmed that Yahweh's attack on Israel, in the broader sense on the book of Ezekiel, includes the context of destruction as purification of Israel's abhorrence. What understanding does this context provide for Ezekiel's Nasa abhorrence? This article describing Ezekiel's Nasa abhorrence in chapter 4 is placed in the context of a sweeping attack on Israel and Jerusalem. First of all, just before that, they are ordered to conduct a simultaneous attack on Jerusalem using bricks and iron plates. It is thought that this is an imitation of Babylonian attack from the setting up of the encircling wall. But in the mock battle, Yahweh said, "With your face turned, you have received it," prompting Ezekiel to take an active part in the Babylonian attack. If the attack by Yahweh and Babylonia are viewed as the cleansing of Israel, then Ezekiel himself is called upon by Yahweh to participate in the cleansing process. And when considering such work entrusted to Ezekiel, it seems appropriate to understand the Nasa abhorrence thought in chapter 4 in the context of the priestly function of removing abhorrence from Israel and the sanctuary. That is, Ezekiel is believed to have participated in the removal of the Israel's abhorrence, understood to have brought about exile, albeit by means of prophecies and symbolic actions from Yahweh regarding attack on Israel. Focusing on Nasa abhorrence and Tahar, I would like to consider the context of the chapter 40 onwards at the end of the book, keeping in mind the priestly context that I have confirmed so far. New Israel after cleansing. It goes without saying that the contents of the temple, the altar, and the law after chapter 40 are priestly. It also can be said that the direction and function of structuring is also very priestly. On this point, Dugard says, indeed, the cosmogonic process of creating and rightly ordering the new world of Ezekiel 40 to 48, in which Ezekiel participates, is a task that resonate with priestly overtones. The process of division and subdivision of border making and hierarchical definition has much in common with the cosmogonic ordering, categorizing emphasis of Genesis 1 to 11, which are widely recognized to be a priestly interest. The point here is that the act of dividing that brings about structuring, ordering, and classification. Regarding the importance of this act of dividing in the creation story at the beginning of Genesis, Mark Smith states as follows. First and foremost, Genesis 1 uses hallmark priestly terms for expressing the division of space and time, namely the verb to divide, lehavdil. Of all the Bible's creation account, Genesis 1 is the only one to use this verb. That term that Smith emphasizes as a priest term in the creation account is the hippie form of the Badal Kibdir, which is used in 42:20, which describes the function of the wall of the temple to separate the sacred from the profane, and is written in 44:23 that the priestly duty is to teach the people of Yahweh between the holy and the profane, and between the unclean and the pure. Regarding Badal Tidiotis states, Badal is used a typical way in the priestly account of creation. The individual phases in creation are depicted as a separation of different elements from one another: light from darkness, water from firmament, day from light, night, etc. The above is the outline of Badal. Chapter 40 to 48, which focuses solely on dividing, can be said to be very priestly, not only in terms of content, but also functionally. Also, dividing is not an end in itself, but it is important to bring about harmony as a result. In this regard, Smith's assertion is suggestive. In the end, the priestly account generates a vision of unity within reality that also links what is separated. The priestly binary construction of the world in terms of holy versus unholy, clean versus unclean, and pure versus impure are portrayed as a series of distinctions within as overall unity. As noted above, Smith emphasizes in the priestly article that division leads to total harmony, and the harmony is attributed to God. Such assertions are quite applicable to chapter 40 to 48. Chapter 40 to 48 depicts the new Israel after its relationship with God has been broken and destroyed it. It marks the creation of a new harmony in which Yahweh can turn under a new division. It is noted that such a harmony was presented by Yahweh himself in the context of the epoch of decisive failure of exile. In this way, in chapter 40 to 48, priestly elements are strongly recognized in the function of dividing between sacred and profane, and purity and uncleanness. In particular, the temple wall in 42:20, which is described as dividing the sacred from the profane, can be said that clearly demonstrate Ezekiel's priesthood. So far, we have contextually confirmed Ezekiel's priesthood. Finally, I would like to conclude this presentation by considering how Ezekiel's priesthood manifests itself. Conclusion: purity laws in the case of Ezekiel. We have identified the characteristics of the priestly disposition in Ezekiel. Ezekiel is a prophet, but behind his activity as a prophet, we can see his attributes as a priest. In relation to the subject of this workshop, Ezekiel struggled to recreate the foundation of the priestly and cleansing regulations of captivity, and it can be said that it expressed finally the realization of purification and restoration of holiness. Perhaps Ezekiel's uniqueness lies in the fact that the priest who had lost the premise for the functioning of the regulation for purification was able to create a new premise through his activity as a prophet. In my opinion, there seems to be a point to evaluate Ezekiel. Thank you so much.
Thank you.